Okay, seller's response. The seller can choose to accept, reject, or counter. Acceptance must be before the offer open until in clause 13. So complete the seller response blanks of time, day, month, and year. The sellers are going to sign, add more lines if you need to. Again, you don't need witnesses for it to be legal, but it's best practice. Yes? We're going to get to your question, I'm sure.
You know the question we're going to ask.
I know the question. Remember at the beginning of the course, and I said there's a couple of issues we're going to cover today because there's misunderstanding. One of them is this about this whole idea of a counteroffer after the deadline. Okay? The way to get your head around this is know what a counteroffer is. A counteroffer is not a kind of acceptance. It is a no thanks, but how about this? It's a whole new offer, really. Technically, a counteroffer is nothing more than an offer from the seller to the buyer that happens to refer to the terms of what this buyer suggested. So, sometimes agents will talk about something being at the counteroffer stage or, as if it's still in play. As soon as the time is up, it's dead, and now it's time for a new offer. A counteroffer is a new offer. So it's not a continuation of the original.
So if my seller doesn't accept and we send a counter, even between the time I send the counter, say that I get it at Sunday at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Is when they want acceptance. And we don't accept, we're going to send a counter.
Yeah.
And I say, well, I can send it Tuesday if I want.
Right.
Between that Sunday night and Tuesday,
yeah,
I can take another offer for my seller.
Of course.
That's perfect.
Yes. Okay, let's talk about this. So if you don't get it, if you have a buyer and you send in an offer, a lack of response by the deadline, all that means, so if I have an offer out there today and it's open till 4 p.m., if at 4 p.m., at 4:01, I haven't heard anything back from you, all I know for sure is you haven't accepted it.
Okay, it's good.
Which means that I can go off and write another offer, I can do what I want, I can follow up with you. So it's open for acceptance. It's not open for counter. Because if you think about it, a seller can initiate an offer to a buyer anytime they want. The same way a buyer can initiate an offer to a seller. We've kind of gotten in the mindset where we're so used to the buyer being the only one that can start something, we've started to think of the counteroffer as being part of acceptance, and it's not. Okay? So a seller does not have to respond at all if they're rejecting. Now again, it's best practice and courteous for them to do so, and it's in our best interest because it's not good for our relationships with each other if you're not getting any response. But we just want you to also be aware of that. So if you send out an offer and you hear nothing back and you call the agent and they say, no, they rejected it and they don't want to sign it, you can't make them sign it, okay? A seller only has to sign something if they're accepting it or if they're proposing a new offer, being a counter, okay? Having said that, most sellers are quite agreeable to sign off on the rejection, especially when we explain to them it's important for, for keeping the negotiations civil and our relationships with each other, right? The only time I think that I've seen a seller that really doesn't want to sign off on a rejection is I've heard of cases where a seller is just getting annoyed because the same buyer keeps coming with lowball offers and they start to be a nuisance. And you can see in that case where a seller might just say, I'm not signing any more of these, right? So, but that's an exception. Most sellers are going to sign the rejection if their agent explains to them that it's helpful. So in this case of you got it later, so now it's like the old-fashioned way, right? You got it the same way you got the PDS and the utilities, and you don't like what the seller is proposing to be done with it, then you need to do an amendment, okay, to clarify that. And that's why it's going to be much cleaner and easier for the clients and for us if we do it the way it was intended. The buyer's alternative proposal cannot be detailed on this form in this scenario. You see why? Because it's not part of the offer now. It's just an information piece. So if they want to do something different, they're going to have to do a clause to address it.
So the buyer doesn't have to initial that at all? It's not part of the offer? Just look at it?
No, they still initial it, but they're initialing it as an information piece the same way they would the PDS. So if the buyer agrees, they will tick the acceptable box, and they will initial at the bottom, and it just goes in file. So it's like the PDS. If they don't agree, they say they don't agree, but then it's going to say C amendment or C termination, because there's got to be something to resolve they don't agree. Okay. So in these cases where the equipment schedule is provided as a document for review after acceptance of offer, the seller's proposed disposition is deemed accepted by the buyer by the clause 4 condition date, right? So all the conditions have the same date. So it's deemed acceptable unless written notice to the contrary or an amendment proposing an alternative disposition. So the process is much more complicated and risky for the parties. So best practice is if the seller does it up front and you get to deal with it with the offer. Okay? So I think really of all the form changes, this is the one that's going to be the most problematic just in bumpy come June, July, right? Because it's a big change. So just, I think the more all of us can make a real effort on July 2nd to get out there and get these new lease equipment schedules up on MLS, like hopefully brokers are going to make that a priority to say, get these on MLS ASAP, because you're going to have all the back ones to do. So you may want to meet with your sellers now and be gathering that info, so come July 2nd, you are ready to. A lot of licensees are already on the ball, gathering all that information at the time they list it, and this won't be a problem at all. But a lot aren't. Yeah, my understanding is it's not one of those things that you have to fill out a blank if there isn't one. But if there, so that would be a good point to ask the commission to send out a clarification on. So thank you for yeah, I think you're asking two different things. I mean, your comment is correct that the seller doesn't have to do a blank, but if they do it and they send it to you, you should respond. But she's saying some brokerages are saying you have to do it. My understanding is that you don't have to do it if it's not applicable. But I'll mention that to the staff to see if that would be a good clarification point. Thank you. Okay, so you see why it's going to work way better if we get those all on the system? So we all know what we'll be doing July 2nd, right? Okay, water and septic schedule 431 replaces the old form 431. Because this is a schedule now, all the schedules are consistent now. One of the things I like about the changes they made is that if you notice, the only place that buyers and sellers now sign an agreement is on the main part. Everywhere else, it's consistent. Initial the bottom of a page. So I like that. We used to have, some had dates, some didn't. Some had times, some didn't. Some had requirements for signatures, some had requirements for initials. Now they're very clean. They all just have initials at the bottom, and the date at the bottom is the date, so you don't need a date at the top, right? Okay, so the reference to the date of the agreement is removed because the date's at the bottom. It's part of the offer. It's going to have that date at the bottom. Content is reorganized to group the seller's obligations in Clause 1 and the buyer's conditions in Clause 2. So all the stuff we talked about with that overall change in due diligence with the regular clauses, same thing applies to these. So these are separate, but they're two separate groups instead of a whole bunch of separate ones. Okay, so it's organized very similar. So they're following the same logic. Clause 3 is a blank available for additional conditions. If you're writing in additional ones, just make sure they're properly worded. So 1.1, provide documents by specified date. And they do make this open for a different date. So it might, you might think you can get all the other documents within 2 days, and you might maybe give them a week to get you this. Whatever you want to ask for. Mark and make accessible. Someone mentioned this earlier. The well, the septic cover by a certain date. Now they've tied this date into this date from clause 3 of the APS. I'm not sure why, but it's tied into that date. If you want it to be a different date, you could change it, right? Provide proof that the septic's pumped within a certain time specified. So whether it's already been pumped or it's going to be pumped between now and closing, either way, you provide that. It used to have a blank and the word years. Notice the word years was taken out, so don't forget to put in the word years or months. Otherwise, you're going to have a clause that says they will do it within 2. Right? So just remember to put in years or months. And I think that was done just because someone might want 6 months instead of a year. Oh, one thing to note about this is the part that's in quotes refers to all reports and certificates in the seller's possession. That raises a flag with me because, again, what if I want something that I know exists but you might not have it? Do you see where you might need to do something extra? Because just because you don't have it in your possession doesn't necessarily mean it's not something that I want. So again, I would be cautious of that. If you think there's something specific that you want that they don't have, you might need to write another clause for that. Water, so they can conduct tests and inspections at the buyer's expense to determine water quality, including meeting Nova Scotia health standards, including, but not limited to that. So that doesn't mean they can't test for anything else under the sun that they want, but that's including that. Quantity sufficient for the buyer's needs. Septic system, condition, and function. One of the things that's missing that has been a little bit contentious among licensees is there's no longer a place where the seller is saying that there's been sufficient water, right? So again, if a buyer wants to add a clause like that, they can. If I was writing an offer for a buyer in an area that I was really concerned about that, you may want to write in a clause. So you can always add things if you think it's needed in a particular circumstance. I think one of the reasons they took it out is because it was so subjective and it was, 4 people, 2 people. That was problematic too, right?
That whole clause covers that.
Pardon?
That whole clause 2.1a covers it.
Well,
that anyway.
2.1a covers the fact that the buyer can do the tests they need to do to satisfy them, but it doesn't cover the seller making a statement as to whether they've ever had water issues. That's the part that some industry members had a problem with being gone. So I just raise it so you can address it if you need to.
It's on the PDS now.
Oh, is that on the PDS now?
You can disclose on the PDS.
Okay, thank you. So on the PDS, they ask them if they've run out of water and...
How is the water quality?
Okay.
If they fell over,
Yeah. So acceptance is deemed on the specified date unless notice to the contrary, so the same way the other conditions work. And again, if written notice is given, either party is at liberty to terminate. The addendum schedule form 420. This is just our catch-all addendum schedule that can be addended to anything. It can be part of an offer, it can be part of a counter offer, it can be part of an amendment. It's just basically extra space to write clauses on an agreement. What page? Page 9, is it? I don't have my book in front of me. Oh, okay. So this is a catch-all schedule. It has a variety of uses. It can form part of an agreement of purchase and sale. It can form part of a counteroffer. It can form part of an amendment. So it's just basically any time you need to write a clause that you don't have another place to put, you're going to have an addendum. It's never a standalone document. It's addended to something, right? So it's not signed. It's initialed only because it's always a schedule. Okay? So just it's going to be dated the same as the date of whatever it's attached to. If it's part of the agreement of purchase and sale, make sure that you cross-reference it, as we talked about earlier, by ticking that other box and writing in addendum Schedule A or whatever, general. Just a reminder for clarity, it's better to use different names for schedules. You know, sometimes you'll see an agreement where there was a Schedule A attached to the offer, and then there was a Schedule A attached to the counteroffer, and a Schedule A attached to an addendum. Like, we can be more creative with our labeling, right? So better to use different so there's no mix-up when you're referring to it later. And also, using descriptive names instead of arbitrary letters makes sense. If it's a schedule about X, if it's a schedule about the roof, then you can call it the roof schedule or whatever. It just makes it a little easier for when you're referring to it. If the addendum requires more than one page, you need to change the page references accordingly so everyone knows that there's more than one page. So just change it to 1 of 2, 2 of 2 initial. So this may contain clauses that you pull from the NSREC clause book, right? Sometimes we're adding clauses that have been pre-drafted by the commission, or it could be free-form clauses that you're just drafting for your client for a specific purpose. The commission asks us to just remind licensees that if you're writing your own free-form clauses, please ensure that they are contractually sound. Get a lawyer to look at them if you're not sure. Compliant. Check with NSREC or your broker if you're not sure. And grammatically accurate and unambiguous. So just a little reminder to pay attention when you're writing clauses. Ensure you're not duplicating any standard clauses and not contradicting any standard clauses. This is really more of a message to the brokers to say, if you have an in-house Schedule A that your brokerage uses, please update it by July 1st so that it meshes with the new agreement and you're not contradicting things. So that's something that should go on the broker's list, to-do list before July 1st. So this all applies whether it's a brokerage-specific schedule or whether it's just a one-off thing that you're writing. You want to make sure it's not contradicting what's in there. Okay, anyone have questions on the addendum? No. Okay, SOBPs, which we still want to call SOPPs, don't we? Yes. It just sounds so much easier to say. Okay, SOBPs. We have our three forms, the same as we had before. There have been a few changes to them, nothing really significant. This is just a general of what each one is, and then we'll go through each one in detail. So the 430A is the sale of buyer's property schedule. It's initiated by the buyer as part of an offer. So it's another schedule that gets attached to an offer when a buyer wants to insert the clause of it being subject to the sale of their property. 430B is the one that gets initiated by the seller. So 430B is one that a seller who's accepted an SOBP and now wants to accept another offer subject to this one falling, initiates this when they're doing the bump, what we call bumping the other buyer, right? So it's initiated by the seller if and when they accept another offer, conditional on this one falling. It also has a section for the buyer to respond. So the middle one is a two-way, right? The first one goes with an offer. The second one goes from seller to buyer, but then it comes back. It's got a buyer's response built in. The buyer responds by either removing the condition or terminating, and then 430C is the one that the buyer initiates if they're making a change. So they haven't been bumped, but they are in a position to remove the condition. So let's go through each one in detail. So 430A, it inserts the SOBP condition into the agreement of purchase and sale. The buyer is going to identify the subject property by address. They propose a deadline by which it will have an unconditional accepted offer. The buyer proposes the number of hours notice they want if they get the bump notice. The buyer and seller only initial at the bottom like any other schedule, right? And the seller's initials do not indicate acceptance, just acknowledgement. I mentioned that on this particular schedule just because in my experience, this is the one that sellers always seemed nervous about, that they think they're agreeing to it, right? They're just acknowledging it. They can respond in their counter whether they agree with it. The seller can counter by deleting the entire schedule if they don't want to accept an SLPP, or they could counter and say, you know, they want 8 hours instead of 12 or whatever. So none of that's really changed, right? It still works the same way it always has. 430B, this is the one initiated by the seller when and if they have another offer accepted, and it's conditional on this one firming up or not. So the buyer is going to respond by either removing the condition, and to do that, they have to be willing and able. So this is the only place in the new forms where there's still proof given. So this bit of proof hasn't been removed. So in the case where a buyer wants to remove the condition instead of being bumped, they still have to provide a copy of the financing letter.
Even though when they get their first, I do know
Yeah.
this rule and I follow it.
Yeah.
But what I find odd about it is when you get that first letter from the bank that says financing approved subject to the sale of their house.
Yeah.
And then once their house is sold.
Yeah, but in this case, their house isn't sold.
Oh, okay, never mind.
Okay, but we'll talk about that in the other case too. In this case, their house isn't sold. So the seller is saying, hey buyer, we got another offer, can you do it or not? It's built in that they have to prove they can do it. Okay? What I find is the biggest change in these forms is the clarity in the way they're written for the default position. I found these were clear when everybody did what they were supposed to do, but when someone didn't give notice when they were supposed to, I was always scratching my head as to whether it was dead or alive. Right? It wasn't crystal clear. The wording now is very clear. If the buyer does not come back with a removing the clause and a financing letter, it's dead. So it's very clear which way it goes. So if you're representing the seller and that deadline passes, your seller's free to go with that new offer. Or if the buyer comes back and says, yeah, I'm removing the condition, but they don't give you the financing letter, you're still free to go with the other one because it's very clear. The onus is on the buyer here. Either you give the proof and you do it on time, or you've lost the deal. So I like that it's more clear than it was before. Okay, everyone's good with that?
Yep.
One thing I forgot to mention when we were on 430A, and I think you'd probably like this part, everyone seems to like it so far. We got rid of the alternative. Remember we used to have two choices of SOBPs? The seller could either have the right to accept one if it was higher or accept anything they wanted. And in all my experience, I never saw anyone use the former one. We didn't use it that often. So I think this is an example of the Forms Committee going, look, if this is only used very rarely, it's causing more confusion than adding. So now it's the straightforward one. Having said that, if you have a buyer who wants it the other way, you can always do that. But typically this has become the norm. Okay. Everyone's good with the 430B. Okay. And notice that the 430B, if they're unwilling or unable to firm up and they terminate, this replaces a termination form. That 430B basically already gives permission. It says it's terminated. It covers the release of deposit. So that's important to know. 430C is the one that gets initiated by the buyer when they're not being bumped, but their circumstances have changed and either they're going to terminate or they're going to firm up. So it could be because they won a lottery or their parents took pity on them and gave them money or whatever happens in those cases, right? The buyer can remove it if they have a firm sale, or they can remove it without a firm sale, but but only if they provide a financing approval letter. So if they have a firm sale, that's one thing, but if they're removing it because of a change in circumstance, they're still expected to provide the letter. So the wording in 430C is pretty much identical to the buyer's response section of 430B. Okay. Only in this case, it didn't come from the seller. It's just a one-way from buyer to seller. Okay, so I don't think much has changed there. It's just really clearer now. In 430B or C, in some cases don't get used at all. So we wanted to talk about the case where sometimes SOPPs just die a slow death, right, and nothing happens. So in those cases, the seller may never get another offer to bump them, and the buyer may never get to the point where they're able to remove the condition. If the deadline in the 430A is approaching, either party can propose an amendment to extend the deadline, but if you don't extend it, it's dead. So it's really clear about that too. So if that deadline comes and both parties haven't extended it, that deal's dead. Okay, it's not firm, it's dead. Just to again highlight the termination. If a buyer is responding to a seller's notice and is unable or unwilling to remove the condition, the 430 clause 2.1b, that affects the termination and addresses the release of deposit. So no termination form 440 is required. However, if the buyer is terminating because the condition has expired, you would use the normal 440. That is not a change, it's just a clarification because it's kind of a subtle difference. Everyone's good with that? Counteroffer. How are we doing? Okay. Still got a ways to go. Counteroffer. There's no significant changes from the old form. It's been streamlined and organized into seller's offer and buyer's response. I like that they highlighted seller's offer because, again, it helps emphasize what we talked about earlier. This isn't an acceptance with conditions. It is a new offer. The ball's now in the buyer's court to say yay or nay. The same as before, the first date refers to the original offer date. The second date is the date time the counter is open until. The third date is the date the counter is being written. That hasn't changed, but as always, be careful with those dates. It's easy to get those confused sometimes. It's still irrevocable, so the counteroffer is irrevocable. So if your buyer has a counteroffer, or if your seller has a counteroffer out there, they don't want to be accepting something else or countering something else. It would have to be conditional on that one. So this is what we were talking about.
What about rescinded? I had one rescinded the other day.
Counteroffer.
Yeah.
What's the difference between rescinded and revoked? Does that mean I'm asking?
That's my question.
Okay.
I've seen it. The broker said it was cool, but
Okay. Well, our standard form right now and our standard form going forward both say that the counteroffer is irrevocable. So it means that the seller can't change their mind. However, if the buyer wanted to fight that, they could accept it and say they have a deal. Now, what would happen? What would be the point really? Probably, but that's what irrevocable means. Whereas an offer is written that it is revocable.